The White Death, Finland's legendary sniper. In the depths of Finland's coldest winter in a century, as Soviet soldiers huddled around their fires in the endless white expanse of 1940, they whispered about a ghost. The Soviets had already learned to fear Finnish snipers, but this one was different. He moved like a phantom through the snow, leaving no trace except the bodies of his targets. They called him Belaya Smrt, the White Death. Moscow had placed a 500,000 ruble bounty on his head, sent counter-snipers to hunt him, and even resorted to artillery strikes against his suspected positions. Yet Simo Häyhä, a humble farmer from WWII who stood barely 5'3" inches tall, continued his lethal work with methodical precision. This is not merely the story of history's deadliest sniper, with 705 confirmed kills in less than 100 days. It is the tale of how a quiet man who loved tending his farm and hunting with his dog became the embodiment of Finland's fierce resistance against overwhelming odds. Before an explosive round would nearly end his life in March 1940, Simo Häyhä would demonstrate how a single soldier's skill, patience, and innovative tactics could change the course of a war and etch his name into military legend. His story would later inspire a generation of special operations forces, while the man himself returned to his farm, rarely speaking of his extraordinary deeds in that bitter winter of 1939 to 1940. A Hunter's Heart, the early life of Simo Häyhä. The crack of a rifle echoed through the forests of WWII in 1915, followed by the delighted laugh of a 10-year-old boy who had just hit his first target. Young Simo Häyhä lowered the Civil Guard rifle, nearly as tall as he was, while his father nodded approvingly. The boy had been born with an extraordinary gift, a level of patience and focus that made him one with the wilderness around him. In these dense Finnish forests, where survival demanded both skill and fortitude, Simo learned the fundamentals that would one day make him legendary. By his teenage years, Häyhä had developed a reputation among the local hunting community. His neighbors often marveled at his ability to read the forest, how he could spot a fox's ear twitching from impossible distances or track a moose through seemingly undisturbed snow. At 17, he joined the Civil Guard, Finland's voluntary militia, where his marksmanship quickly caught attention. In shooting competitions, the quiet farm boy consistently outperformed military veterans, securing numerous trophies that he would later display without fanfare in his modest farmhouse. The 1920s saw Häyhä settle into the rhythms of agricultural life, tending to his farm with the same meticulous attention he applied to his shooting. He raised cattle, grew crops, and continued to hunt, seemingly destined for the quiet life of a Finnish farmer. Few who knew him then could have imagined that this unassuming man, who stood just 5'3" inches tall and preferred the company of his dogs to most people, would become the most lethal sniper in military history. Yet the skills he honed during these peaceful years, his intimate knowledge of the landscape, his ability to remain motionless for hours in the bitter cold, and his uncanny marksmanship, were quietly preparing him for an extraordinary destiny. In 1938, as dark clouds gathered over Europe, Häyhä's life remained largely unchanged. He continued his daily routines, waking before dawn, tending to his farm, and occasionally participating in shooting competitions where he consistently scored remarkable results. His favorite rifle was a Finnish-made Civil Guard M2830, a variant of the Mosin Nagant, which he had customized to his exact specifications. He couldn't have known then that this same weapon would soon become an instrument of warfare rather than sport, or that his quiet days of farming were about to transform into something far more grave. The skills he had spent a lifetime perfecting would soon be put to a test that would reshape history. The peace of rural Finland was about to shatter, and with it, the simple life Simo Häyhä had built for himself. But in those last quiet moments of 1939, as he worked his farm and cared for his animals, the man who would become known as the White Death was already uniquely prepared for the brutal winter that lay ahead. He just didn't know it yet. Winter's Fury, Finland's resistance against Soviet invasion. Dawn broke over Helsinki on November 30th, 1939, with the drone of Soviet bombers. Without a declaration of war, Stalin had launched his bid to conquer Finland, sending nearly 500,000 troops and thousands of tanks across the border. The Soviet leadership, confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority, expected the campaign to last less than 2 weeks. They had not accounted for the Finnish spirit or the brutal winter that was about to become their worst enemy. In Rautjärvi, Simo Häyhä received his mobilization orders with characteristic calm. As he packed his rifle and winter gear, his neighbors rushed about in panic at news of the invasion. The temperature had already plunged to minus 20 degrees Celsius, minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit, and the days had shortened to mere hours of murky twilight. Häyhä knew these conditions intimately. They were the same ones he had hunted in all his life. But now his quarry would be far more dangerous. As he departed his farm, he took one last look at the wooden target he'd practiced on for so many years. Its center was completely shot away. The Finnish defensive strategy centered on the Mannerheim Line, a series of bunkers and fortifications along the Karelian Isthmus. But much of the fighting would take place in the deep forests, where small, mobile units of Finnish soldiers could outmaneuver the massive Soviet formations. Here, in terrain that swallowed entire divisions, a man like Häyhä would prove invaluable. The Finns were outnumbered 3-1 in men, 30-1 in aircraft, and 100-1 in tanks. But in these woods, such numbers meant little. Häyhä was assigned to the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 34, positioned near the Lutheran Church of Kola. The Soviet 139th Division would soon learn to fear this quiet sector more than any other along the front. In the first days of combat, Häyhä's company commander noticed something remarkable. While other soldiers fired dozens of rounds in firefights, Häyhä would fire only once or twice. Yet after each engagement, when they counted casualties, his shots invariably found their marks. The quiet farmer was about to become a legend. The winter of 1939 to 1940 would prove to be one of the coldest in recorded Finnish history. As temperatures plunged to minus 40 degrees Celsius, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, Soviet tanks froze in place, their crews trapped inside. But for Häyhä, the extreme cold was an ally. In these conditions, the steam of human breath could betray a sniper's position. The Soviets would soon learn that their enemy was not just the Finnish army, it was the winter itself, and a man who had mastered its harsh demands. The White Death was about to begin his work. The tactical genius of Häyhä, mastering iron sights. While other snipers adopted telescopic sights, Häyhä stubbornly stuck to iron sights on his M2830 rifle. His reasoning was both tactical and practical. Scopes could fog or freeze in the brutal cold, and more importantly, they required the shooter to lift their head higher, exposing themselves to counter-snipers. In the dim Arctic winter light, the glint of a scope lens could mean death. Häyhä's dedication to iron sights would prove prophetic as Soviet counter-snipers, sent specifically to eliminate him, fell victim to their own scope's reflections. His methods seemed to defy military doctrine. While modern snipers worked in pairs, with a spotter calling distances and wind conditions, Häyhä operated alone. He would pack dense snow in front of his position, both to provide a stable shooting platform and to prevent the muzzle blast from kicking up telltale powder that could reveal his location. Most ingeniously, he kept snow in his mouth while shooting, ensuring his breath wouldn't create a visible vapor in the frigid air. Each morning, he would meticulously note the weather conditions, calculating how wind and temperature would affect his bullet's trajectory. The battlefield became his workshop of innovation. Hayha wore white camouflage when most soldiers still wore standard uniforms. He developed a technique of targeting officers first, knowing the Soviet troops relied heavily on direct command. Some days he would eliminate over 30 enemies, each shot carefully placed. He preferred to work in temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius, -4 degrees Fahrenheit, knowing the extreme cold would force Soviet soldiers to cluster around fires, creating perfect targets. The Soviets began to whisper that he was no ordinary sniper. He was using magic to guide his bullets. But there was no magic to Hayha's success, only meticulousness and patience refined over decades. He would often spend entire days in a single position, completely motionless despite the numbing cold. His fellow soldiers reported never seeing him hurry or appear stressed. Between kills, he would calmly clean his rifle and check his equipment, maintaining the same methodical approach he had used on his farm. When asked about his extraordinary success, he would simply say, "I did what I was told to do, as well as I could." As his reputation grew, the Soviets deployed an increasingly desperate array of countermeasures. Artillery barrages would pummel his suspected positions. Counter-snipers would set elaborate traps. Some days, entire Soviet companies would spray the forest with automatic fire, hoping to hit the invisible killer. But Hayha had learned from hunting that the forest itself was his best armor. He would simply shift positions, find new angles, and continue his lethal work. By January 1940, his confirmed kills had surpassed 200, and the Soviets had given him the name that would echo through military history, the White Death. The legendary Finnish sniper, Simo Häyhä's record-breaking feats. By February 1940, Soviet intelligence reports painted a terrifying picture. A single Finnish sniper had accumulated more confirmed kills than any marksman in military history. Their tactics of sending counter-snipers had backfired spectacularly. Hayha had eliminated each one, often using their own aggressive techniques against them. His rifle count had surpassed 500, with an additional 200 enemies eliminated using his Suomi KP-31 submachine gun at closer ranges. The Soviets were tracking his daily averages, and the numbers seemed impossible. On his most lethal day, he had eliminated 25 soldiers in a single shift. In the command bunkers of the Red Army, generals pored over reports of this phantom sniper. How could one man cause such devastating losses? The 500,000 ruble bounty on his head, equivalent to several years' military salary, had only led to more Soviet deaths as ambitious marksmen tried to claim the prize. Their most experienced counter-snipers, men who had trained specifically for eliminating high-value targets, were being outmaneuvered by a farmer. The psychological impact on Soviet troops was becoming a serious tactical problem. Soldiers were refusing to take forward positions, convinced that movement meant certain death from an invisible enemy. Hayha's daily routine had become a masterclass in precision warfare. He would wake hours before dawn, coating his rifle with fresh snow to eliminate any shine. His white winter warfare suit, now stained with forest debris for better camouflage, made him virtually invisible in the snow-covered landscape. He chose his positions carefully, often lying in wait where Soviet supply lines intersected with natural clearings. Unlike other snipers who relied on long-range shots, Hayha preferred to work closer to his targets, rarely taking shots beyond 150 meters. This unorthodox approach allowed him to ensure kills with single shots, conserving ammunition and minimizing his exposure. The mathematics of Hayha's accomplishments became legendary among military analysts. In less than 100 days of combat, he had eliminated more enemy combatants than entire platoons. His efficiency with ammunition was particularly notable. His kill-to-shot ratio approached 90%, at a time when military doctrine considered 10% acceptable for snipers. Each morning he would clean his rifle and count his remaining ammunition, marking his kills in a small notebook with the same attention to detail he had once used to track his farm's expenses. When asked years later about his extraordinary numbers, he would simply say, "I only did my duty and what I was told to do as well as I could." By early March 1940, Häyhä's presence had become such a significant factor that Soviet battle plans were being altered to avoid his suspected hunting grounds. Entire companies would detour kilometers out of their way rather than risk crossing open areas where he might be waiting. But the Soviets were about to try one final desperate measure to eliminate the White Death. They were preparing to unleash an artillery barrage of unprecedented scale on his position, a storm of steel that would forever change the story of history's deadliest sniper. The Day of Reckoning at Kala Front. March 6, 1940 dawned with an eerie stillness over the Kala Front. The temperature had risen slightly, creating a thin fog that clung to the snow-covered ground. Häyhä moved through his morning routine with characteristic precision, unaware that Soviet artillery observers had finally pinpointed his general location. As he settled into his chosen position, an explosive round fired by an unknown Soviet soldier at extreme range found its mark. The round struck Häyhä's jaw, tearing through his left cheek and destroying much of his face. The impact was so violent that it spun him in the snow, his white camouflage suit now stained crimson. Fellow Finnish soldiers who found him described a horrific scene. The lower half of his face was nearly gone, but incredibly, he was still conscious. The man who had survived countless counter-sniper operations and artillery barrages had finally been struck. As they rushed him to a field hospital, Häyhä drifted in and out of consciousness. He would remain in a coma for 7 days, during which time peace was declared with the Soviet Union on March 13, 1940. In a twist of historical irony, the shot that nearly killed him probably saved his life. Had he remained in the field, he would likely have faced the massive Soviet offensive that broke through the Kala Front in the war's final days. The damage to his face was catastrophic. His jaw was shattered, his left cheek destroyed, and several teeth were missing. Finnish medical personnel performed multiple surgeries, piecing his face back together through 26 separate operations. Despite the severity of his wounds, Häyhä demonstrated the same quiet resilience that had made him such a lethal sniper. He endured the surgeries without complaint, though speaking was impossible for months. When he finally regained consciousness on March 13th, the first news he heard was of the peace treaty with the Soviet Union. Finland had ceded territory but maintained its independence, due in no small part to his own extraordinary efforts. President Kyösti Kallio himself visited Häyhä in the military hospital, promoting him directly from corporal to second lieutenant, a remarkable field promotion that had never been given before in Finland's history. The promotion was extraordinary not just for skipping several ranks, but because Häyhä was a common soldier from a humble background. As he lay recovering, newspapers across Finland celebrated the White Death's contributions to the war effort, though the man himself showed little interest in his growing fame. When asked later about the shot that nearly killed him, he would simply point to his scarred face and say with characteristic understatement, "They got me." His recovery would take years, and his face would bear the scars for the rest of his life. Yet in those final moments of consciousness on March 6th, as the explosive round found its mark, Simo Häyhä had already secured his place in military history. In just 98 days of combat, he had achieved what no sniper before or since has matched. the quiet farmer who never sought glory had become a legend, though the price of that legend would be etched permanently in his flesh. The quiet return of Simo Häyhä, life after the war. In the quiet farmlands of Ruokolahti in 1945, a familiar figure with a scarred face methodically tended to his dogs and hunted game as if the war had never happened. Simo Häyhä had returned to the life he knew best, refusing offers for public appearances and declining interviews. The legendary White Death preferred the company of his hunting dogs to that of journalists and military historians who sought his story. His war medals, including the prestigious Kala Cross, lay quietly in a drawer while he focused on rebuilding his farm and life. Despite his disfigurement and the constant pain from his wounds, Häyhä found peace in the rhythms of rural life. He became an accomplished moose hunter, his old skills returning despite his injuries. When Finnish President Urho Kekkonen, an avid hunter himself, invited him on presidential hunts, Häyhä accepted not for the honor, but for the simple pleasure of the hunt. These quiet expeditions with Kekkonen spoke volumes about his character. Even in the presence of Finland's highest official, he remained the same humble farmer who had once protected his nation. As decades passed, new generations of military specialists studied his techniques. The U.S. Marine Corps incorporated his methods into their sniper training programs, particularly his innovations in winter warfare and camouflage. Yet Häyhä himself showed little interest in his growing international reputation. When a rare interviewer managed to ask him in 1998 about the secret to his success, he replied with characteristic simplicity, "The key is to shoot the enemy before they shoot you." In his final years, living in a small war veterans nursing home in Hamina, Häyhä would occasionally receive visitors from military units around the world. Young snipers would seek his counsel, only to find an elderly man who preferred to talk about his dogs and hunting than his wartime exploits. When asked how he had become such an excellent shot, he would simply say, "Practice." He lived quietly until his death in 2002 at age 96, outliving most of his contemporaries and seeing his beloved Finland prosper in the peace he had helped secure. Perhaps the most telling insight into Häyhä's character came in one of his last interviews, when asked if he regretted his actions during the war. After a long pause, he replied, "I did what I was told to do as well as I could." A man does his duty. In these simple words lay the essence of Simo Häyhä, not a mythical super soldier, but a farmer who had perfected his craft and used it to defend his homeland when called upon. The fields where he once hunted invisible prey had returned to peace, and the White Death had become once again what he had always been at heart. A quiet man who preferred the company of his dogs and the silence of the Finnish forests. The legacy of the White Death, Simo Häyhä's enduring influence. In modern warfare academies from Quantico to Kiev, instructors still speak of the White Death with a mixture of awe and scholarly interest. Häyhä's techniques, particularly his use of iron sights and natural camouflage, have influenced generations of marksmen. U.S. Marine Corps sniper training manuals still reference his methods for concealment in snow, and his record remains unbroken. The closest competitor, a Canadian sniper in Afghanistan, achieved his kills from distances Häyhä would have considered unnecessarily showy. But perhaps Simo Häyhä's greatest legacy lies not in his extraordinary kill count or his innovative tactics, but in what he represents to the Finnish people. During the darkest days of 1939, when Soviet forces seemed unstoppable, his exploits gave hope to a nation fighting for survival. Today, Finland maintains one of the world's most effective reserve forces, built around the same principle that made Häyhä legendary, that a single skilled soldier, intimately familiar with their terrain, can become a formidable weapon. In an era of high-tech warfare and satellite guidance systems, his story reminds military planners that the human element, patience, skill, and intimate knowledge of the battlefield remains paramount. At the Finnish Sniper Museum in Miehikele, Häyhä's rifle rests in a place of honor, its iron sights still aligned exactly as he left them. Next to it lies his simple field notebook, where he meticulously recorded each day's work with the same care he once used to track his farm's harvest. But the most telling exhibit is perhaps his farming ledger from after the war. Where kills had once been tallied, he now recorded milk production and crop yields. In the end, this was Simo Häyhä's most remarkable achievement. Not that he became a legendary warrior, but that he remained, at heart, the same humble farmer who answered his nation's call, did his duty with extraordinary skill, and then returned to the quiet life he had always preferred. In the snowy forests of modern Finland, young soldiers still train in winter warfare, learning to move silently through the same kinds of terrain where the White Death once hunted. They use advanced optical sights and rangefinders, but their instructors remind them of the fundamentals Häyhä embodied: patience, precision, and the understanding that technology can fail, but skill and determination endure. The legend of the White Death lives on, not as a celebration of war, but as a testament to the quiet courage of a man who perfected his craft and used it to defend his homeland, asking nothing in return except the peace to return to his farm and the company of his beloved hunting dogs.